to talk about emotional dysregulation and what that looks like. So, you may have heard the term, but what does it really mean? So, emotional dysregulation is when someone has trouble managing and controlling their emotional responses to something, right? Now, maybe you felt this energy when you've gotten like super angry or overwhelmed over something small, or maybe if you've just kind of had that feeling like you're just riding this like really extreme, intense emotional roller coaster and like there's no end in sight, right? Like there's no calming down, there's no nothing, and it just feels really overwhelming. So, for a lot of people, this can also show up as things like mood swings, impulsive reactions, or maybe feeling like they just kind of can't keep their emotions in check. And it can make life feel really chaotic and it makes it a lot harder to navigate. So, I'd like to say that emotional dysregulation isn't just like feeling really emotional, right? It's a real issue that can actually seriously like disrupt your day-to-day life as well as your mental health. And that's why it's important to talk about and that's why it's important to address. So, the next question is where the heck does this stuff come from, right? Like how do we get to this place? So, there are many different causes for emotional dysregulation. I'll say it often stems from things like trauma, ongoing stress, or mental health conditions, maybe something like a PTSD. And a lot of people who are experiencing this are already working with a therapist because they're dealing with trauma, difficult life events. They're dealing with their own mental health conditions, right? They're on top of stuff. But not everyone with emotional dysregulation is going to necessarily be in therapy. And some of these people might not even recognize that emotional dysregulation is what they are experiencing when they are experiencing it. So, now that we kind of know what it is, I think it's important to talk about how this can really impact us negatively. Like, right, what are the consequences of having this and leaving it unchecked? So, it definitely can lead to a lot bigger problems if we don't address it, right? And it kind of creates this domino effect that just continues to spill out into different areas of our life until things just feel kind of unmanageable sometimes, right? So, one of the most common or more common things that emotional dysregulation can lead to is impulsive behavior, right? People making rash decisions, acting out in anger, and sometimes even turning to like really harmful coping mechanisms like substance abuse, reckless driving, or just kind of risky activities in general. And the reason that's usually happening is if you have not experienced emotional dysregulation before, it's a lot. And you just want to be so out of that space that you're trying anything you can think of to get out of it. And because your rational thinking has shut down when you're in that space, you tend to sometimes make poor decisions, like some of the things that I mentioned. So, that is one area of negative impact or consequences that can happen. So, let's talk about emotionally, right? So, emotionally, it can take a really big toll on your relationships. So, kind of constant outbursts or maybe some volatile behavior or just like an overpouring of emotions, they can kind of scare people. They can freak them out, make them uncomfortable, and it sometimes will push them away. And so this sort of behavior will, often cause strained relationships with like friends, family, coworkers, things like that, because of the intensity of the reaction they are experiencing from you. And so in some of the more extreme cases, it can lead to, isolation or the loss of really important or stabilizing connections that the person who is experiencing the emotional dysregulation really needs. Now, if we want to talk about things mentally, there's also a significant risk there as well. So consistent dysregulation can actually add on to conditions that people have like anxiety and depression. It can exacerbate other existing mental health conditions, which are already really difficult to manage. It can also it has another layer on top of it of just bringing up a lot of intense feelings of guilt and shame after someone has kind of an episode or an outburst. And that can be really difficult because it adds another layer to the emotional burden that people are already experiencing these types of situations. Another issue with emotional dysregulation is that it can actually manifest physically. So, experiencing chronic stress like that can take a really big toll on your body, and that's going to create some physical issues, sometimes like headaches, digestive problems, really extreme fatigue. And then over time, if that continues, there's also a possibility that heart issues can occur because of the constant release of like stress hormones, which could also be a pretty major concern, right? And I think another thing that's kind of difficult to talk about is that In really extreme cases, emotional dysregulation can sometimes lead to self-harm or even unaliving thoughts because the intensity of the experience is so overwhelming that people feel incapable of managing their emotions, particularly if they don't have the proper support or tools in place to kind of help them through that situation. And last but not least, dysregulation can really impact people on more of a practical level, right? And this shows up as a disruption in sort of like day-to-day functioning, right? So it might be harder to focus on things. It can impair your decision making, right? It makes it harder to make decisions. And sometimes it can just cause problems at work, school, or even when someone's trying to take care of just like basic responsibilities that they have. And that's why I think it's so important to work on really regulating your emotions, because the price that people are paying for ignoring it is just way too high. So now that we've gone over what emotional regulation is and how it can really impact us, the next question becomes, well, how do we navigate ourselves out of that space? Because this is the part where a lot of people get stuck. And I think it's important to know that if you want to work through your emotional dysregulation, you have to get grounded and you have to get into your body. Now, those are unfortunately the last things that dysregulated people want to do, right? It's already uncomfortable and sometimes unbearable, right? Experiencing that extreme level of emotion. But the only way out of that is going to be through. So your body needs to actively process your emotions in order to get the release that it's needing in order to make all of that stop, right? And so another reason people are particularly challenged by trying to figure out how to regulate this is because we tend to live our lives kind of in our heads most of the time, right? And we want to think our way through problems. Now, sometimes that can be really helpful, but when we're looking at things through the lens of emotional dysregulation, you can't just think your way out of it, right? Your body is holding on to a ton of stress or trauma, which means that you need to work through that physically if you want to return your emotions to a more neutral or manageable state. Now, if you're curious about how to get into your body, if you're brave enough and willing enough to try it, there's a wide variety of techniques that people use, right? So first and foremost, working with a therapist is definitely going to give you some ideas, right? And some good feedback. But if that's not your thing or you're not into it or can't do it for any reason, general things like breath work or body scans are just a good place to start. But don't be afraid to try some more out-of-the-box tools or techniques if those things don't work for you. You might prefer alternative methods like movement, right? Like taking a walk, working out. Maybe you want to surround yourself with a comforting scent or even a weighted blanket. Doing some earthing could also help you really process and release your emotions. That's something I like to do. It helps me out a lot. But I think it's important to remember that everybody is totally different. So make sure that you find something that feels good for you. Something else I want to address is therapy, right? So if you're interested in working with a therapist to help you with your emotional dysregulation, I think that's a fantastic idea, right? Things like this can sometimes be really difficult to manage on your own, especially because you don't always know like what gears and levers are being pushed in order to create and elicit certain responses and what's unique to you that's creating these things. So I think it's good to a certain extent. However, one of the problems that I have with therapists is that they only focus, many of them, focus on what's going on in your head, right? Things like changing your thought patterns, your mental frameworks, and that is important. But sometimes they forget to incorporate the body and address what's happening like in there also. So the reason that that's important is because your body holds all of the trauma, negative experiences, memories, and injuries that you've accumulated throughout your lifetime. It doesn't matter if your mind remembers or not, your body is always going to retain that information. And it's smart enough to send you signals when something needs to be addressed or healed. Something specifically like creating some very intense emotional dysregulation, which quite honestly is pretty difficult to ignore. So that's why I really just truly believe that if you want to heal, it's important to work with your brain and your body as a team. They have to work together. Now, I think traditional therapy usually works for most people at first, and I really do believe that it's important to get your headspace under control before you start trying to work your way into your body, right? Having a good understanding of your thought processes, your behavioral patterns, And especially the motivation behind your choices and actions is really important. But the thing is that your body covers a lot more surface area than your mind, right? So like nose up and then like nose down is kind of how I like to think about it. So if the two of these things aren't being addressed together, you're going to find yourself in a position where you're not healing and then you can't figure out why. So this is actually the point where I find that people start becoming really frustrated with therapy. They find themselves in these positions where they're just like upset and kind of like at their wits' end because they're making such a big effort to heal themselves. They're doing everything they're supposed to be doing, but they still feel like they're stuck and nothing's getting better. And I think that's a really hard, kind of like opposition of forces, and your mind kind of gets confused. And I think that's really difficult sometimes. And you're like, I'm doing all the things, but nothing's happening. And we start to feel like maybe we're doing something wrong when we're not. So if you find yourself in this position, please know it's not your fault, right? If you're showing up, you're doing the work, you're making the effort, it's not your fault. And you're doing a really good job at working on yourself. But it's just unfortunate that not all therapists are educated or well versed in things like somatic or experiential work. Things that can get you really into your body and provide that last layer of healing that so many of us really need. So if you're working with a therapist and you're not making any progress, I think it's definitely worth asking them if they can incorporate a more body-focused approach into your sessions that maybe traditional talk therapy might miss. Now, healing looks different for everyone. So I think finding the right methods for you are important. A very, very wise friend of mine always says, fail fast. And she says that when you're looking for the right therapist. And essentially that means if something isn't working, don't be afraid to acknowledge that and move on quickly to the next therapist to find someone else who's a better fit. So as you can see from everything that we've gone over, working on healing your emotional dysregulation can feel like a really big mountain to climb. And honestly, that's why so many people, they tend to avoid doing it altogether. So when I'm faced with really tough situations like this, or things that feel overwhelming, I always find it's best to start small and just focus on whatever the next step is, right? Because that strategy is going to keep you from getting overwhelmed, and it's going to help you break the process down into more like manageable or digestible parts. And quite frankly, focusing on like one thing at a time, it just kind of feels better, right? Like you don't have to think about the 12 steps, you just have to think about the one. So if you are someone who's experiencing a lot of emotional dysregulation, or you're supporting someone who is, I hope the information that I've given you today is helpful in some way. I know this work is hard for a lot of people because leaning out is easier than leaning in, even though that's exactly what's going to help you facilitate the healing that I think that you definitely need and deserve. So if you've enjoyed this video today and the information I've shared, please give me a little thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more like-minded content. As always, I really appreciate your guys' support. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope that you have an absolutely beautiful day.